Okay. Hi, everyone. Oh, no, let me-
I can see.
Oh, Melvin's here. Yay, we can get started. Okay. Welcome, everyone. No, I was just saying, in case she's not here already. She might be on her way. I don't know.
She is. She's okay.
Oh,
Scared me.
okay. You guys want to stretch?
Sure. Let's do it.
Yay. Head, breathe in. Over to the right. Out, breathe in, fill up the rib cage. Get out, let go. Come up, breathe in, breathe out, come over to the other side, let everything go. Take a nice deep breath in, fill up the rib cage. Let it go. Back up, now the elbows.
Triceps hurt. I'll stop the play-by-play.
That's okay, Jackie, you can do it. Stretch, okay, wrists. Wrists are important. Fabulous.
Spider-Man.
Good. Sides. Out. Let's see what else do we have. That's fine. Oh, here's a good one we do in improv class. Put your hands together like this, and then loosen your jaw. Completely let your jaw go. And then you go, It's simply. Well, it's good.
I can't do that.
I can't relax my jaw.
I can't.
It's really good. It looks a little bit ridiculous.
Don't do it, no.
I can't.
Oh, come on,
I'm
Melvin.
stuck in a cringe.
Come on, Melvin. You're gonna be good at it. You know you will. You know you want to.
I can't relax my mouth.
Do it.
There we go.
Alrighty then.
Okay, now that we're
The
stretched.
big O notation.
Yes. Okay, Matthew, did you stretch? Madison, anyone else? Dan? Okay. Good. Melvin is in the building, and he just did a funny thing. I don't even know what you call that.
I don't know
A stretch.
what you call it.
I don't know. Okay, so hi everyone. We're going to be talking about Big O notation, and we're pretty much just going to resume this where we left off. So Mappy and Madison, you guys can watch the video of our last class so you can see what we skipped. Basically, we're just talking about Big O notation. Does anyone remember what that is and what it does?
Performance of an algorithm.
Yes, it's a way of measuring the performance of an algorithm, and it's a specific notation in order to do that, which measures the way an algorithm scales in terms of two constraints. Does anyone know what the two constraints are? Time and space. Right, so we will show this, and we might go back and talk about some of these other things a little bit later, but let's... Yeah, I just wanted to see if we could get to the graph that will actually show what it does. So,
Oh.
Ah, here it is. Okay, so we can see here that we have a graph. This is our friend. No, that is not what I wanted. It's not a graph. They lied. Okay, sorry everyone. Oh, here it is. So this is our friend, the graph. Does everyone remember this from our algebra class, a pre-algebra class? We have a y-axis, right, going up and down, and then we have the x-axis goes across. Everyone remember that? Everyone good with that? Adrian, you remember this from algebra? This is the y-axis, this is the x-axis. So in the context of big O comparisons, this y-axis represents the time, right? And the x-axis represents the data or space. So why is this important? Well, we talked about a linear time complexity model. So what does that mean? Which one? This would be this one, right? Because linear is a line. So basically, as we keep adding more and more inputs, the time stays the same. Lauren's coming, but late. So this could be described as O to the 1. We saw this in our example with the first function that just basically console logs the first item of an array. So the array could be 10 megs, it could be 100 megs. We're just console logging the first item. So it basically takes the same amount of time, basically. So therefore it is linear. It doesn't have to be flat. Just because it's linear, the line could go up. So it could be that when we give it 2 megs, it takes 1 minute. When we give it 4 megs, it takes 2 minutes. When we give it 6 megs, it takes 3 minutes, etc. But it's a linear progression. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Madison and Mappy, does that make sense to you guys? Hopefully. So let's get back to okay, so we'll just start at the very beginning of big O notation. Does anyone know how to start the slide from a given thing? Isn't it like Shift F7? Shift F5?
Maybe.
It's just F5? Okay. Yeah. No? I thought it was like Shift and
If you
F7.
hover in the bottom right, the little icon in the bottom right of the screen, of the window.
Bottom right side.
Wait, hold on. No, I gotta go back to the right slide first. Efficiency. Okay, so let's see.
Yeah, bottom right of the
Bottom
window.
right
Right,
here.
left.
This
No, left. Those 3, 4 icons. Hover over them. One of them, I think, is like start and current.
normal slide reading slideshow. This one.
Yeah.
No, I think that's from the beginning. They changed it around.
Let me just see what this does. I'm just curious. Oh no, that
Oh,
works.
there it is. So that one works.
Okay, so we're going to start with our presentation about big O notation. So let's get into these bullet points here. Big O notation lets us describe how running time scales when we increase the size, basically. So we're talking about the relationship. What these graphs do is they allow us to examine the relationship of 2 different inputs, right? The x and the y. That's all basically linear equations are doing. That we're examining the relationship between the 2 inputs, the x and the y. The x being the space and the y being the time. Did I get that right? The x is the space and the y is the time? Yeah.
X is your input.
The x-axis is the space, right? And the y is the time, I believe. We can go back to that slide and see, sorry. See, the thing is, we're all experienced web developers, but none of us really know that much about these kind of computer fundamentals. And the reason for that is it's not really that important to what we do in terms of web development, but it's good to know this stuff nonetheless. So we can see that if we go back to our graph here, which I think was number 79, we can see, yeah, the time goes along the y-axis and the input, the data goes along the x-axis. Everyone see that? Okay, cool. So now we know. So big O notation is denoted with a big O, hence the name big O notation. And the growth factor is in parentheses. For example, if it grows like 1, in other words, it's always going to be the same, then it's O1. If it grows to the n, like we're looping over an array, then it's going to be O to the n, because it's the number of complexity is going to grow with the number of items in the array. Make sense? There are other classes in addition to this, like we can get into doing the exponents. If we have a nested for loop, anyone paying attention in our last class that remembers what this is? Yeah, Jackie.
No.
You don't?
Oh, yes, I do know what that is. Yay.
So if there's one for loop, it's O to the n. If there's a for loop nested in a for loop, then it's
Square.
n squared. It's O n squared. O n squared. So if it's 2 times the length, it'll take 4 times the time. If it's 3 times the length, it takes 9 times the time. So this, as Sam pointed out, is quadratic. It's a square, right? 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, n squared is n squared. Running time grows as the square of the input. So let's see if we can, if we run find duplicates, it's going to use this quadratic time complexity. So quadratic time complexity is a class of time complexity, right? That can be denoted with big O notation. So you guys can all say that in your job interviews. Sounds smart. All of that. So what is 3 nested for loops going to be? O n to the third, right? Makes sense. If we have 4, it will be O n to the 4. However, rarely is it ever really this simple. This sort of shows that you have some basic understanding of how this stuff works. In real life, when we write our algorithms and stuff, it's never just a for loop nested inside a for loop nested inside a for loop.
I mean, that would only work if you're iterating over the same thing.
Right, yeah. So when we get into expressing the time complexity of most of the algorithms that we actually use, it's a more complicated equation. But it can be expressed mathematically as an algebraic equation. So we can look at how fast binary search is. Is it one of these or is it something else, would you say? It's something else. Why? Because it's, tell me, guys.
Binary is more.
Well, binary, there's more, and it's also not as simple as a for loop or a for loop nested inside a for loop. There's more complexity that we can't quantify just by raising it to an exponent. We have to do some more fancy math to get into exactly how it's working. Does that make sense to everyone? Hopefully that explanation is sufficient. So we can use an algebraic equation to explain the time complexity of an algorithm like bubble sort, or which one were we looking at? Sorry, fast sort? Binary search. Yeah, so all of these algorithms, we can write algebraic equations to quantify the complexity, and it just gets into some fancy math. So as I think we saw in one of these slides, it says that if any of you, took calculus and especially liked it, you can get really into this stuff and look at how to write these expressions to quantify the time complexity. You're not going to really need it that much. So how many times do I divide L to get to N by 2 numbers to get to 1? Okay, so how would we quantify this expression? How many times do I divide this number N by the number 2 to get to 1? So if we're thinking about this in terms of time complexity, right? Yeah, so this doesn't, so let's take a look at what is LG8. So logarithms, we're getting into talking about our friends' logarithms. Anybody who took trig or calculus or anything like to explain what a logarithm is?
Base.
It's a base
Base 2?
It's
It
base
has to be
2.
base 2 for that to work.
How can we base 2
For the B3.
Yeah. Okay, and then this is base 3. Yeah, so I don't think they're really showing it to us in a good way. So, okay, so we're looking at logarithmic complexity now. So let's go back. So we're looking at how do we quantify the complexity for binary search. So binary search is not just raising n to a power, as we saw with for loops nested inside of other for loops. It actually grows as we keep growing, which is what we call a logarithmic growth spiral. Basically, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger the more as far as we go. So and we can use logarithms to quantify this, and we need to know, I guess, what the base is. You were saying, right, Nelson? In order to do that, so there's 3 steps. Then we're going to add the digits and repeat. If any of you guys remember how binary sort worked, we stepped through it in our last class. So it basically loops over the things, and then it says if it's larger, you're going to put it here. If it's smaller, you're going to put it here. And then if it's smaller, use a while loop to go back over all of the ones before it and put those into place as well. Welcome, learned. They're not here. We're talking about algorithms and big O notation. You were here last time, so you are good with this. So now there are 4 steps. So this is going to be much faster than our linear search algorithm that we used, if you guys remember, right? Did we run the time, the benchmarks on it? I don't think we did, but it is much faster. So we can see if the input size is squared, it's going to run at 2 times the size. If our input size is raised to the 3rd power, it's only going to run at 3 times the size. So we can see it keeps getting smaller and smaller. The larger our input gets, the more efficient this algorithm actually gets. So this is what's called logarithmic time complexity, or O log n. So log n is how many times do I divide n before I get to 1. So this is how we figure out what the logarithmic growth is, right? Is that what you were saying, Nelson? So hopefully this makes sense. Any questions on logarithms? Do we want to get a little clearer on how this is working? Or are you guys pretty much good with logarithmic time complexity? I mean, here's the thing. If you're good at math, you're probably going to go and look this stuff up and get better at it. If it's totally like foreign and alien to you, you probably aren't going to really do too much more delving into this, and that's okay too, because we don't really need this to be web developers. Yeah, you know.
How would you apply this in an application?
So this comes in handy in computer science when you're writing in languages like C a lot of the time. Like for a lot of the very basic stuff that we used to have to do as computer science in the 80s and even the 90s and stuff, this is very fundamental to that. Now there's so much infrastructure like NPM and JavaScript and things like that. A lot of this sort of core base level work is really done for us. So to be a web developer in JavaScript and make apps and stuff, you really don't have to know that much about these computer science fundamentals.
Like when you scale, do you have to apply some science to?
Yeah, if you have a really successful app and you have millions and millions of users and it scales, yeah, that's when you absolutely start to need this stuff, because that's when efficiency starts to become really, really important. And even still, there are a lot of open source libraries out there. A lot of this work is sort of done for you. So you really don't have to learn this stuff like as much as we had to in the 80s and 90s if we were coming into this field. Yeah.
Go back and apply whatever.
Yeah, you can usually go back and apply whatever you need. Hang on a second, Nelson. The important thing about this, though, is that it sort of trains our brains to think about things in a certain way. It teaches us to solve problems in a certain way, which does translate whether we're doing things like this on the low level, calculating time complexity, or we're writing JavaScript functions. Bless you, Jackie. We're doing something in Express. This is just kind of trains our brains to solve problems. So it's good for that reason.
If you have an idea, for example, to scale for some reason, is there a particular way to build your application so when you do run into these problems in the future, it's compatible?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can get into talking about that. That's kind of like out of scope for this thing. But I posted some stuff about Heroku, how to make things scale on Heroku. So that's very important to think about that when you're building your apps. How is it going to scale? So I posted some stuff about how to make your app scale on Heroku. The number one thing is that you want to make your app scale in a clustered environment, because your app is basically only going to be able to grow in Node to the size of the server that it's running on. And then if it needs more memory, it won't be able to do anything. You can use an NPM library called Cluster that will make it take advantage first of all of the cores on the Heroku server that you're using, because the Heroku servers that you use have actually 8 cores. Because Node is single threaded, you're only using one of the processor's 8 cores. So if you use this library called cluster and follow the instructions I sent out, and I can send them out again, you can take advantage of all 8 cores and have it scale up to multiple virtual machines if you want to. So that's like the #1 best way to do it. Also, you have what are called CDNs, content delivery networks. Have we talked about that at all? Like Akamai? Yeah, so we use those for Bootstrap or jQuery. You can get one of those for your own content too, and that's what most big sites do. So the content gets cached. Like if you have a web page, an HTML page that has some content, what happens is they use one of these content delivery networks to cache that page. So their system will go and hit your website, take a snapshot of your website and host it on their system. So all of the visitors to your site will actually end up going to their server and seeing the snapshot that they took of it. For this reason, your site will get a lot less traffic. So it's able to run a lot faster. So the top 2 CDNs are called Akamai and Cloudflare. So you guys might want to look into setting those up for your projects. And it will also save you money on your Heroku hosting bill as well. So back to logarithms. What is log 8? Anyone?
Number of times you have to divide 8 by 2 to get to 1.
Yeah, number of times you have to divide 8 by 2 to get to 1. So 8 by 2 equals 4. 8 divided by 2 equals 4. 4 divided by 2 equals 2. 2 divided by 2 equals 1. So log 8 is 3. But if this is still confusing, is that confusing for any of you guys? That seems pretty straightforward. But in a way, it is confusing. If we start talking about logarithms, we say, yeah, fancy math. That's confusing, but it really isn't. So you can think about it like this. These are the different classes of complexity for big O notation. You guys should take this note, write this stuff down. This is important, or at least remember it. We have been over these. What's that? We'll slack out the whole slide deck, yeah. Any questions on these, though? We have basically linear complexity. These 2 are both linear complexity. This is one that doesn't grow at all, which is very rare that you can just put, a terabyte or a petabyte of input into your application, and it'll be the same as if you run it with 1K.
What does the input size mean?
The size of the data you're running through.
Right, it's the size of the data you're running through. So this, you give it the x, remember, you're calculating y for x, right? So you're saying y equals this. We're calculating the time it takes to run, which is the y-axis, based on what the x value is. So if I'm putting a 2 megabyte input into my application, it's going to calculate what the y value is, how long it's going to take to run to get me to my output. So that's the first class, is just it doesn't grow at all. The second class is it grows linearly. So if I put 2 megabytes in, it's going to take 2 minutes. If I put 4 megabytes in, it's going to take 4 minutes, etc. Does that make sense to everyone? Next class is raised to a power. So we do this like with for loop. So if I have to loop over all of the items in an array once, what's it going to be? How do I describe that application in terms of its complexity? If I have an application that loops over all of the items in the array once with a for loop, how do I describe that with big O notation? It's O and it's just O n, right? And then, so then if there's a for loop nested inside a for loop and they both loop over every item in the array, then it's what? O n squared. If there's 3, it's O n cubed, etc. Right, guys? Makes sense? Then we have binary search. So this is a logarithmic type complexity. So if we get 8 items in with binary search, then it's going to be log 8. So this shows you how this would work. So if we have this one, this is going to be the same all the way across. Then we could have this linear class that grows as we keep adding more and more input into it. The time it takes to run it grows linearly. See how it's a straight line? Yeah, everyone see the straight line? Cool. Then we have the O to the n complexity, which grows more. As we can see, it gets steeper and steeper the more that we get. And then you have some that are the square root of n as well. That can also be a thing. And then you have some that are logarithmic, where it gets shallower and shallower in terms of the curve as farther along we go. hopefully this makes sense to everyone. I never got that far in math really, so I'm probably not explaining this as well as somebody else, but I think we got a working definition of how this all works. Pretty much. Questions on this? No? You guys, let's see what else. So data structures we're gonna go over on Saturday.
I think the important thing is just what impacts on the performance, what things, for example, that you said about the nested loops, and that way we know that and we can avoid.
Yeah, so we're looking at performance. We've been talking about performance gotchas and performance snags throughout the course. I've been saying don't do these things, they're not efficient, do it another way instead. Like I've been saying, don't use for loops, use reducers and filter and sort and things like that instead because they're hardware accelerated. So I've been giving you guys some good notes throughout the course on how to make your app more efficient. What this conversation on Big O notation is supposed to do is teach you guys basically how this Big O notation works. How do we quantify the complexity of our application using this form of mathematics? Yeah, Russ.
So O end to end, that would be like chess, like finding the best solution for a chess game.
Yes, that would be O n to the n. Yeah, that would be like we were talking about Dvorak or whatever, the Knight's Path algorithm. So that would be, yeah, O n to the n is like the most extreme that you can have. So I don't know what you're talking about specifically with the chess game algorithm. There was one we were talking about earlier with the Knights. Yeah, that might be even more than O n to the n, in fact. I don't know how you would, I mean, I don't know enough about it to really say how that, I think that would be an even more complex algorithm. O n to the n means whatever the length of your array is, you're going to loop over it that many times. So if I have an array that has 4, here I can show you guys pretty much how I would write this just real quickly. So you have a function. Call it Q. It's going to take an array. So now we have one for loop, and we're just going to say var I equals 0. I is less than r dot length I plus plus. Hi, Gretel. Hopefully you didn't get too wet. Oh no, I don't even need that. So this is all it would be, Russ. We're calling this function recursively on itself for as many times as there are items in the array. So if there are 4 items in the array, we're going to loop over our array 4 times. If there's 10 items in the array, we're going to loop over it 10 times. Any other questions on Big O? People watching from home, any questions? Mappy's good. Madison's good. Okay. Work on your projects.
Yay.
Yeah, we'll take the rest of class to work on projects. I'm here for you guys if you have questions. TAs are here for you guys if you have questions.
I got to finally like put everything together. I mean, I didn't try, I just. Because I still have to do this one.
I think I'll watch this late.
The actual sorting with the tags was done.
You can mix something like that.
Regular expressions.
The
Regular expressions. When you call. So yeah, just have one of Yeah, I was looking at
Okay.
So I'm guessing that well, we need to have
Microsoft has
Jonathan, do you know our schedule?
yeah, Microsoft is good.
Are we here for 3 more weeks or 2, Jonathan?
We what?
Are we here for 3 more weeks or 2?
So maybe this, how many weeks is the second one?
Exactly the same. I mean, they're 24, so this is 22. What's 24?
Oh,
The project will be the same. So we have another 2 weeks to work on projects, I guess, after this. Okay.
yeah, graduation is the 14th. So not next week, but week after. That Saturday is graduation. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, it did go by quick.
Some people are really good at it. They do a fucking great. They got it. They were able to get the full game.
So we went to that shit.
If you want to add this to your
Oh, yeah, that's fun. That's you can convert that.
Yes.
Yeah. There's
Look, man, don't worry about what the cost is doing.
Goes to US.
Is that your second?
He did all the graphics.
Oh, I think at this point, we had to just reverse it and make sure that it's all related with what she was to the two other three that four. So we had to smack it out. Yes, but it's just something about
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I know. He, I guess, posted something like a few months ago, and it came up as Joan Martin. Is it graphic or is it like and then I started going through the pictures like, holy fuck. Yeah. And apparently today, like that's so aggressive. Is that even like a please stop? Yeah. Crazy stuff.
I think that's liquid
So ideally, I would like changes made on Saturday. Maybe Saturday, scheduled to be done on Wednesday. Staff field.
Yeah, I think that's What the heck happened to the music?
Yeah, I always have that. 4 or 5 years, if I sit too long.
It's all zero. What are you getting?
Let's never get back to it. No, but no, I nothing was pulling up last time.
Why?
Oh, like you could have
I was missing with the way you were doing it. I think I can make it work that way. Okay, this is the only fancy that we're doing that yeah, this is what it's really great. This is like where it gets the weird thing to it.
Yeah, but didn't you update it?
Yeah, and then I did that.
Yeah, see, it's
Yeah, it's
Okay, so
yes. You might have to,
Okay, why don't you just do this? Once you get like if you're like volume to yeah. You know what the methods are. It's the same one.
Because this is what we're doing, we're delegating, so
Oh, I was messing with it.
Yeah, I don't know. Look through there. Oh, right. Oh, right here. Look at this. Get calculated. Get all these methods.
Is there a way to okay, so the executive package is for all
Right. But then each, so for example, you would say require water. Right. You're requiring one type of you guys do it when I click on then that's gonna look like it's gonna kind of look like
so you have this divide.
okay, so it's gonna require another require only one that file will require two.
Okay, yeah, because I see that the functions are involved inside of a different file, but inside of that file, you don't call all the functions to work globally.
The off zero function, so we're on all zero. You try using enough US. Okay, so yeah, you gotta like save whatever you're getting back to variable.
I'm making nervous, man.
Use these methods.
Oh, look over here. All right, go over here.
It just takes a while.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah, I went back and forth and started learning more of those software and all that I did, and it's a little hard to get around.
That's when I
So
started.
here, I have this thing. It's clicking on it.
Well, if you click on any other, it'll give you the context for everything.
what I can do is I can stop later. October 2016, a year later. So it was exactly a year later.
I swear, like whenever I scroll through it,
So before I come to see that already, because the base was available. So here I can do this, so that's.
Every single word you say, for you save the night.
What's funny about it, like I said, because if you want to start clicking on any other tool, you will actually use the context of that particular So literally anything that's deep, it'll return back a
Yeah, so it's not hard.
You have a class, bro. Where you guys delegate, help you with coaching.
Oh, yeah, so there was this class. That's what sometimes.
Oh, you know what? Like, change it back to point. If you want to call back and change it to range, that'll give you at least a result. Because quantity won't give you anything back. It's not even on my database. I don't know why I lost it.
Every single word you say, for you save the night.
No, this is literally giving you all that's the range for everything. Yeah, that's the weird part is that for some reason this shows up and it hides the other. It hides the other keyboards.
Oh, I see what's happening.
Yeah, technically everything goes here. You know, this constant logic
Every time I shine myself that photo, it gives me those. I try to look at some like bootstrap concepts that can it doesn't accomplish what I want
try typing in on me.
Oh, I'm just
to. Well, we only had that for us because of
Oh, yeah, because I did this one.
There's
If you want to do the text, if you didn't have that text, you could just.
oh, that's right. Is that where you have this one?
No, when I'm talking with the class, what I have as well.
Oh, not if it's
Because I'm literally just playing a non-design.
Let's fix one.
Yeah.
First, let's try to get this to show up right. Just I guess that's and then we'll fix the job.
It's only because once you change I to show,
Yeah, so we just
and then it'll actually.
So then there's that. But you know, it needs to be a little bit.
Oh, so you don't have that. You don't have that handle.
So where's that example? Remember you had
What do you mean?
Yeah, no,
basing this page off of the table.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you have that.
Which is kind of weird because I was looking at how they made the table for this, and actually, the only thing I couldn't understand is just the Ajax call because it was so as an object.
This one changes.
But other than that, once you put the correct API parameter, it literally generates the whole table for you.
Yeah, it just does, sortable.
Yeah, something like that. But like I said, I really don't need all that. All I was missing was this child. I went over the orientation on number.
How am I sure?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so we're doing like.
Now see,
First, add your first row onto here, and we're yeah, it's gonna be a nice table.
See, I was thinking about doing like that. The only thing that really confused me was how do I know that these two tables are connected? You know what I mean? Like on that one, it's gonna be the same way.
It'll
so
go
then
next.
you have a function that fires like
Yeah, so we'll figure that part out. That's a good question.
so for you to be able to say
When you do this correct, because it's gonna do the
you have
same
to create
exact
another
Yeah,
each row
I guess
function
it was like a-
that has changing and then you save it to the state.
So, I mean, the important thing is we end up with so let's, we have our table now, we're going to see this.
Oh, that's oh, so you both get the
Yeah, all we gotta do is
Also, it tends to be button inside. Could I have put a button in just well, I guess I like that either way.
Is everything gonna match up? Do you want to take one of the
Members is
Unless you want actually solve it, yeah. Exactly, because yeah, outside of the router, you have to get your router IP. So that's the IP that everyone else in the community sees, right? And then you do it to the port 4. So on your machine, on your machine,
sometimes I little barely let him tell me such a big
yeah, their own router using their own what you're gonna do is you're gonna have to figure out what the IP address of that machine is. Whatever. If you have Windows, you go to CMD and do IP config. That'll give you your IP address. You go into your router, and there's a section somewhere for port 4. IP address should be port 4. Then you give it a code to the outside door. That's going to be another part of the server. 8888. Then you port 4 88. So you're going to say that private port and the public port, you go the front port, what's that? You're going to be able to anywhere access your machine from the outside. You hear by clicking the extra of your router or and that will redirect you go to IP.com, you'll be requesting the router. We don't go to these. Okay, so let's yeah.
Guys, just wanted to tell you about 80s Smash Hits performance. They want to be the most popular. Michael Jackson, Air Supply, and more. And if you click to listen to the other updates, let's just say
what are the
you see
you have like 4 is the name of that location, number of guys?
You might not know it, but prices on Amazon change a lot. But Honey's got your back. When you use Honey on Amazon, it automatically searches Amazon's 2 million sellers to find you the lowest price. It even shows you the price history of the item you bought, so you know if it's a good time to buy. Join the 7 million people using Honey to save money at work. It's free and takes just 2 clicks to add to any browser. Click the banner now or visit honeyhoney.com/Spotify. So you're closing down the dance floor. You need a non-stop soundtrack. They are made without added charges. It's premium. Tap the banner now to learn more.
I'll make sure they're interested. It's not no, just straight. No, just quotes. Exactly. Do it for you. And then number of guests. Combo, yep, and then remove that last one. Okay, so we have the state. Go scroll down to where you have all your inputs for each system. Right there. So we're gonna have to give it a few things. For each, so this is gonna have a name. And then the 2 functions, or 1 function. The first one's going to be the name. This name that you get each input has to match the name of your state. So for example, the first input you have is the, okay, the number, yeah, you already have it, so you need that. Yep. So we're going to do the same thing for event name. So for the first input, do name equals event name, just like that. Yeah, text is fine. Name, this would be event, like this, whatever you take on that. Yeah, we're not just
Oh, I see.
Only the brave find hope in a second chance. Only the brave find hope.
Yeah.
Only the brave find hope.
Just takes practice.
Nice, man.
And then
It's so weird because I went over 100 ways to English. I guess one makes sense to you.
oh, select.
yeah, you
just
just
do
do
research, select.
Yeah.
Well, you don't have them right now, so you can nice. We're not gonna. Oh no, you didn't make one. Okay.
Yeah, I know it would have been a lot easier on me.
I mean, not necessarily. I think you're doing pretty good.
So now we're gonna give it.
John, you don't understand how this
We're gonna attach the state
yeah, I see.
to the value of each one. So the number of guests, ACF's value is equal to this plus state number of guests. So saying the value of this is gonna be the same thing that we have in the state. So we want to do the same for each. So for each, we're going to do value equals this plus state dot, and then whatever name, the example.
Yeah, that's all you need. So, I mean, obviously, there are a bunch of ways to do this. I think if just looping over, making a row for every thing in the database, then you could be doing this on the back end, so if you wanted to.
What do you mean on the back end?
Like, you could put it, are you using handlebars?
I'm not.
Yeah, no, so this.
Oh, I saw Gene in the back. Okay, I saw Gene.
Yeah, put it together and then send it. And then how many are there going to be in the database? Because you might want to use the data tables thing so you can get the pagination and all that stuff too. You know what I mean?
Yes, so they don't have a long table and stuff. Yeah, I mean, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna have most places gonna have, like search and stuff like that. Just because some people prefer where they want to go, and they want to look up all over the place. I'm in Miami, I want to go to Houston but that's right. You told me about a project or something like that.
Yeah, so we can talk about that. I want to get a like I was talking to the guys who I'm working with. And they said, yeah, they would do it. So I thought of you. I thought of you. It's a little bit sales. Yeah, so yeah, I'll be in touch with you.
Yeah, let me know. Like I said, I don't know how far you're on for him. It's on 148. It's a little more south down. Or
yeah, I don't think it's going to come out there. So just check it out.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, how big is your office?
Well, right now I share my office space. I usually share it with a lawyer. It's a pretty big office, but right now I'm the salesman basically, yeah. So not only that, like I'm trying to get more into this side just because none of my developers know how to go on the back end.
Right. So now, like, if you know all this stuff, you can write it out.
Yeah.
This is a good idea for a project.
Well, if you don't mind me asking, man, do you know like what industry is it in?
Yeah, it's you could say it's like transfer. It has to do with tow trucks.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's basically it's an app for tow trucks.
Well, that's the cool thing because I've been in logistics for my family and stuff, logistics transportation company. So I'm like part of the board for like 5 years. So when it comes to like brokering, freight and all that, I have experience in.
Yeah, no, I figured it would be good for it. I thought it'd be good for it. I think it's cool.
I mean, this is what I'm doing. A lot of these companies, like they say they claim to invest technology. Me as a user, I don't see the technology side. I see literally a layer like this. Obviously, it's a little more complex. But I mean, for being at the side of the transportation side, you know what?
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of technology. There's a lot of those types of things. Yeah, there's a lot of disruptions.
Really, there's a lot of more disruption. I mean, it's one of the industries that I personally assume that lacks in technology. I mean, like I said, it's technology, but I'm talking about. No, man, like I said, I'm always open to sales and stuff like that.
Yeah, so let's talk about it. I'm going to talk about it as a target. We can probably work on an app.
So Valley's going to work it out.
You know, like I said, I know people like yourself who get some more experience in technology. Like if it's definitely just sales and marketing and advertising for sure. I mean, even our agencies are really have partners, you know. So yeah, so when it comes to the advertising and marketing,
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I will be able to.
For sure, man. Just let me know. Hey, thanks a lot, man.
Yeah, no problem. Glad you got it. Yeah, this is looking really good.
Looks like it should work. No, one last thing. So when you submit this, technically, in theory, it worked. But the page will refresh. So we still need to have your your form is gonna have its own on submit, and we're gonna do the event that we did earlier. Actually, this will work without you having to submit. You don't need to submit it. It's ready to be saved. So let's go up. Let's actually show the date. So you have a form on submit. So let's create a new function called a handle submit. Pass in, and you're gonna pass in event as a not like parentheses.
Actually, what's close?
Is this the last one? Okay, perfect. Just event, and then open and close your bracket. So we're gonna do event.prevent default like we did. Okay, and in the new line, let's console log everything that we saved so far. So we're gonna console log this dot state. Just that. So we want the whole thing. All right, so let's try that.
I'm gonna outline this and he goes through and
Okay, line 25. Go to line 25. Oh, you erased it out. Oh, wait, you erased it. No, this. Oh, yeah. This is event on target. And let's target that. Event dot target. Wait, actually. Yeah. And then make a new constant called a value. And it's going to be equal to target dot value. That's here, it's short. No, yeah, we are. Say that. Wait, can you open up the console? This state. Because right, this is different. That's what state. So this is the I think you have to do this. Yes. So we define this that. Right. This is that. You want. Okay. So go back. Do you know if there's any how do you console log the state within a function in React? The only way I know right now is binding this and the constructor. Like we're just trying to console log this dot state, but this is undefined.
So there's a tool, I'm going to Google it, but there's a command line tool for Chrome Developer Tools. Look up React plugin for Chrome Developer Tools and install that. I think that's part of the answer. How to console. Or you can just put the console log inside the curly brackets in the JSX. Try that.
You want to do it in a function after he submits? You want to, what do we do? This is a form. You want to see everything that we saved in the state. Oh, you do that. Oh.
Wait, let me see the code.
So we have like the form on submit. We're gonna handle submit. So it's gonna prevent the default, and we're just gonna console log everything that we saved from to the state. It says that this is in the and I noticed that we did this came from React. You gotta do bind the this the constructor and the this for the head of the thing. So I'm wondering if you have to do maybe that, like just give it this to the constructor. So that's how we're doing this outside of state.
Oh, okay, so do this. Put event, comma, state, so the second one can handle state. And then just pass in state and then console. So get rid of
like
this. Yeah, just console log state, and then wherever you're calling, you submit on submit. Yeah, so you can comma. No, dude, make that an arrow function inside of there. So before the this, put open and close parentheses, and then equal sign. Well, you get then just go all the way back. Do everything inside there. Delete this, and then so put the curly brackets, and then inside the curly brackets, you're gonna put open parentheses, close parentheses, equal sign, greater than. And then handle submit, parenthesis, disgusting. Wait, is it?
No, it's passing into my default email. You don't want to keep that as a
No, so that means you put it in here, and then inside and then here, put E, comma, disgusting. That should work if he has the context tool that's available.
No, E, comma, disgusting. Yeah, save it. Backup. Oh yeah, yeah. This yeah. There we go. Just sucking gibberish into no, just fill out the form, submit it, and we should get back to you. Perfect. There we go. That works. Okay. So now that you submitted the form, everything's being saved. So we have here everything you tried to make, right? Except for the rest of it. So let's go back to figure out why we're not going to So the dress code is a little bit different because it's select. The each upper valley clothing that's event target value, event target value.
Supposed to have like that last pass that she like did here.
Yeah, about the same.
Yeah.
Okay, for dress code, type in casual. Actually, no. Let's scroll down. Remove the selected. And then, yeah, let's leave it as casual. Okay, so go up. Make sure it's casual with capital C. Go back. Yeah, which is capitals that we call. It is. Okay, so it is saying it. Or it is, oh. Now, okay, so. Yeah, so type in random stuff. And then you can choose to either leave it as casual or change it. Because we were only saving the state when you change something. If you don't change anything, then nothing gets saved. So now that we have a default value for dress code, it should work even if you don't change it. Change it or whatever you want. It should work either way. All right, so now we get everything. So now in here, this is where you would do whatever you want. Everything's saved to the state. Here. So you can do whatever you want with the values from there. So if you want, the dress code, it would be state.dress code. And it would give you back form casual, the value for that. State dot event name would give you back. So that's how you yeah. This is where you would do anything with that. Right?
I'm gonna go get dinner.
All right.
So long, Grace. You want your minutes? Anyone want
Jackie wants a burger.
We need to put a burger by that one around here. And you're vegetarian. I This is universal.
Yeah.
If it's far, it's 2 miles away.
Yeah.
That's just something that did. Yeah.
Yes, React App.
Yeah, that's gonna be our. Yeah, that's gonna be our.
I mean, is there? There's gotta be, but finding one.
Like a good one. And you have to.
There's a React Materialize.
Material UI. Yes, Material UI.
She's looking for a template that has like materialized and everything.
Material UI, yeah, it's like the components. But like it's not a template and stuff.
Oh, baller. There's a template that comes like this for React. This is a template from GitHub. It's React Materialize admin template. You clone the repository and you just do an aggregate start. That's it. And it has you know like higher components and everything that you have. I'll select it to you. Wait, you guys are going to BurgerFi? We might all.
Yo, John, Steve.
Yo, what's up?
Yo, what's up, dog? Hey, listen, quick question, man. Yep.
Okay, wait, what language are you in? English. You're in English. All right. What programming language?
Sequelize.
Sequelize. Okay, that's quite a change. Okay.
This is doing, anyway. One thing about so just that schema. Come on, I think. I have this right here, but this video has more information within it. My question is it
I know, right?
like acceptable, or should I do it different?
Oh, sequelize.
Yeah. The other thing is, I saw that it's possible. I'm not sure how to call this.
I think it is. Because like when even in their example,
I saw something similar like this.
yeah.
They usually also just go.
Obviously not the same, but I'm saying.
So shall we go to
Let me ask you the question.
You're in modern child.
I think I want to Shake Shack. Yeah. No, I don't think they ordered. Where are you?
Let's go. Let's take a class.
You want to go to BurgerFi?
So
BurgerFi, Shake Shack.
that's like another thing, method as well. Just take the table so you can have that yeah, that's
Yeah.
Yeah, with Mongo, you can actually nested inside of wrappers and stuff. Like
Delivery's gonna be like 45 minutes.
Yeah. Just take it to them.
That's
I'm not.
Even if it takes you a little while longer to
Alright.
Shake Shack's a lot closer. You're tight on money. Excuse me. How's it going? Where are you going?
Everyone's an adult. I thought some these days you just like
Yeah, it's generally like adult is in here for
yeah.
I don't know why I'm texting my mom right here. It's just so ridiculous.
I did it all.
I couldn't use it.
on his body. Everyone is interested. From that point on,
Oh, they were gonna go.
there's more products than you did that night. There's a lot to do.
Oh man, that was a crazy night.
Boys were gonna go and then stop. That's great.
I want to modify my CLI app to just run React. So that I don't have to do it.
I put this, and I put a sample job description.
I know you're trying to, I know you're trying to talk to pero I mean,
No, I'm not doing it. Not right now. Mike, beautiful, you are.
Damn, bro. Taking me way back. Hey man, can you just save your projects and make some whatever you want again?
Two.
Oh, two.
I've taken two like 4 times.
TQL, skate drop, and all this and that.
It's like an extra home now. Or we really needed it now? Okay. If we disappeared, would they even notice?
I mean, we've only been asked like, what, 5 months?
Yeah, that's not good.
I was sleeping like this, I think. On our login screen. Okay.
And then now, my relationship next year is, and now. So now I can.
Like situation should that like accountability to like so the technology is site, you're on exactly the right path. So they're doing a site, pre-planning, or if it's operating. Okay, no way.
So here.
I said writing. No, so, if you, like I have a system that hired my student, and I have a writer, and a writer.
No, I was trying to pull
So,
the change from master.
it's hard to see where So that might be that.
So all I need to do is to make
That's
sure
a whole
that,
separate.
in order to make sure I meet my bench, to this.
Yes, no. There you go. So like that, something like that.
Okay, so just make sure this is on short sheet before I do anything more.
Yeah, make sure you use the short street.
Okay.
What do you have?
Alright.
But, when we make.
Okay, so what are we doing now? So as soon as you telling me, identify and delegate tasks.
Or, I know. My friend does that.
How good is your handwriting?
It'll transfer.
Because if you read my handwriting.
You say, okay, this is how,
Here, you want to use my
So back to your question with the writers, you can pick the contracts. This would be VIPs. So like if Michael Jordan comes to the Fountain Blue or whatever hotel.
with the size you said.
Maybe there's like a few specifically for like when you're setting up somebody, but trying to do that. When we went through those notes. Oh, you won't do.
What would be the best way? Try to find out. Filter out.
It means, figure out which pieces end up getting in as a component.
Yeah.
So do I make this button and picture together, or do I keep them separate?
Yeah, anyway, so here's the meeting point. Here's point A.
Entiendo tu punto, pero los propósitos de los components es que no cada cosa que está en el sitio tiene que estar en un component. Si es algo complicado o algo que se repita muy seguido, pues sí. Pero si es algo sencillo, pues no se tiene que ser su
This person is gonna get.
Popular, you can't get rid of that.
That would be one component.
That would be one component of that chemical thing.
Well, to your question.
Right, but if I'm not, even if the buttons don't do anything complicated, and if we're always gonna have the navigation bar on the page, then
Yes.
the navigation with the buttons is one component, as opposed to making it the nav bar for the buttons.
What component for a navigation? Repeat that inside the navigation.
Bueno, los dos tienen su al sentido mío, si me decís, tiene más tiene todo eso.
Yeah, it's. Do you remember what we had to do when we got the React script not found or whatever?
That's what I was actually trying to go on mine. It's my favorite now. Did you do a yarn install?
You might have to do that again. Yeah, I think that fixes it.
Did it?
Yeah, do it again. I think sometimes it's like messes up or like yeah, you just reinstall it. I think that's how we fix
This
it.
comes back when you're using quad. Oh, you mean the folders? Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, sometimes they just mess up.
Damn, bro, I can't downgrade my node server.
You should be able to.
The later version of Node is already installed, set up with G now.
You guys have okay.
I'm buying a power strip. Oh, there you go. Oh, booyah. Dude, this shit works.
Well, that's the good thing about having all that other stuff you need But here's my question, I don't think, are you proposing that each of us focus on certain components? I'm asking, because I don't know what it's programming is.
That's what the other, I've been telling you about that too. You know, and what the other thing too. Okay, fine. I want to be, I don't want to let On a board. Yeah.
Gee, man, what the hell does this guy do? Look at his reading.
I already know.
What is that?
It's the React homework reading. What the hell?
I'm good. I know it's. I hold it well, I told him.
This might be easy.
Oh, just because. But I
He committed the command. Yeah, like the link that he posted was this. It's really weird. So I clicked on the folder and then it was like, boom. Okay, so let me just use my little tool to view the reaction.
I love Endeavor. Ironically, everything I look for is it can't be anything A because of accommodations.
CSS animation or
I know. What's your last name? How do you incorporate? Yeah. How do you what's the skin of the words? I know because we were just talking about like an anagram or something. This week I was talking about I was reading
Like I said, in this case, you have to have everything. Format.
I decided to write my personal. I never spelled your last name. I got that again for the program. Sorry. It's out of the office next week. Como que no sé manejar y tengo un carro de agua,
Yeah, I agree.
What about like having to do it after
Like I said,
Oh. Oh, they have some.
Hello.
Hello.
I was checking over some of the requirements that show on one of the PowerPoints, saying that there's like 3 deliverables. The last one's obviously like the final presentation, but there's 2 before it. With the due date for the first one, it says July 2nd, but that's Monday. Is that correct? Or do they need Tuesday? Saturday?
Where did she put that in?
Well, let me get
What channel?
I don't remember which channel.
If it was in the Tuesday, Thursday, then I would say the 3rd. If she put it like a general channel, then it's the 2nd. It's like the start of the week.
It's not even. I wasn't even the one who downloaded it. That was single date. I don't even remember what channel it is. But would it help if I showed you? Maybe you could verify with something you have on your GitLab.
Well, actually, here, let me look at it's saying and Siobhan isn't replying to anything. But I would say maybe it is like because that's the sort of week. That's what this thing is due.
Our things to do the
because she's been busy with her.
No, that's career. That's what it goes. The yellow one is career. Oh, these are career. Oh, you're saying this is due the 14th.
That was my understanding.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's graduation day.
No, I don't like looking at this thing. Whatever, that's the time. Yeah, so I just wanted to confirm that there is a requirement to deliver what the actual date was for the first one.
Yeah, I would go off based on whatever she said.
And then if it's saying Monday, then I by default assume Tuesday. Right.
Where are you supposed to submit that to?
Let me see if it's
yeah, check. Because if it's on Google Drive, Google Doc, then obviously keep it all on there.
We're just going over what we need to get done there, dissecting components, and three's the crowd. So I figured look at something else. Okay, so I don't know if that looks familiar whatsoever. Back to the down to the here. Requirements, all that. Deliverables. Instead of homework, you'll be required to submit more project deliverables.
No. Deliverables is an in-class thing, so yeah, it is Tuesday. It's the second. That's during class. The deliverables during class. You present during the class.
Okay, so then in that case,
Right. The first one would be the 3rd. The second one would be the 10th.
And then the final presentation is the 14th?
The 17th. Oh shit. Yeah. Yeah, I have graduation on the 14th. However, demo day is the 19th. What I have on my calendar.
Which that I was aware of.
Okay, so they probably pushed this back. Yeah. So yeah, I would say maybe these two. I don't know if she's pushing it. Yeah, I would just keep these two, and then the 14th or 23rd.
Okay, so we just have to have the deliverable, the first one,
Yep.
and then a working app by the
Week
following.
after, yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah, by that point it should just be the font.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, then as far as you're aware,
Which isn't much.
if you're not much, I'm not. Okay. So here we go. The plan must include overview of the content application and why it is valuable. All of that needs to be included according to the test. Because the one that I didn't expect was a screenshot of your project management report, which will break down the tasks. Assign your group members to the schedule. Everything else I can basically understand and know why it's being asked. That one I didn't expect it to request.
I would just, even if the simplest thing would probably be to use GitHub board, GitHub project board. I'm assuming you guys have like a common repo, like one repo where you guys are all.
Yeah, we even have we went one step further and made it an organization.
Shit. Okay. Well, in there should be. Yeah.
I remember using it for the first project. I never touched it since then.
Yeah, you can go to. Where is the project?
The board?
Yeah.
Project?
Yeah, so you just create a project.
With their stuff.
And then actually.
I think it lives in the cloud because a lot of this stuff is gonna have to be. So, an executive, the CEO.
So projects, you create a project, and then you just just do something. And send that. Break down the task, assign to groups, and schedule. Then you can get those.
You know the messed up thing is that I keep thinking of this YouTube ad. It's like project management tool.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, so create a project, just say call it whatever, and then create a bunch of issues, right, on your repo, which are going to be your tasks, and then just drag and drop the issues on the project. So, you would put the different tasks. You would have your backlog, your in progress, testing, and then shipped. That's your progression. Right, so you would have, partner would be, well, no, that doesn't keep track of your schedule. Maybe you can't use.
So yeah, because otherwise I think they would have mentioned GitHub.
Yeah.
Immediately.
I mean, which is easy? Trello or Jira is definitely. Yeah, Jira's good. Trello or Asana. Yeah, a lot of hey, something. I don't know which one would be easier. Look at Trello, look at Asana.
Wait, but why can't you use GitHub?
Because they need a schedule. Each member is gonna be able to do this by this day. You can't.
How do you spell it? No, when you
you can name them whatever you want, and you can add whatever you want onto this.
That's true. They would have to include every issue.
You just have a due date.
Yes.
Write in a due date.
And then everything would just be backwards. Everything would just be, if they do backlog, everything would just be.
Yeah, because you haven't started. They don't have that stuff.
Then just do GitHub, create new projects, well, whatever, create a bunch of issues, which are going to be your task, and in the title for the issue, you're going to name it, create server file, whatever, and then do, and then give it a date.
Okay.
And then you assign it to someone. Yourself or someone's going to be taking care of that. And then you just put it in the project. And it's going to automatically show up in the one project that you create with the card like that. It's going to all show up like this. And it's going to say do this, do on that, and it's going to say who's assigned to.
Got it.
That's it. That's going to be easy.
All right. So that'll count as a value.
Yeah, that's going to be your
I know they gave an example here, so I just want to double check anything before I go.
It's a new song. It's a new song. Like the top of the line.
Okay, so it's saying it once.
all of the technical stuff are off. Yeah, you really want to get this.
So,
yeah.
If I understand correctly, this first part could be basically like a paragraph. The second one, it gives this as an example. Whatever. Say like UI, UX, flow. I figure Robert, Roberto, and my team already has something like this. Don't know if that was.
Yeah, man. Yeah, that's great. That's awesome.
Okay, so you already did that job without even being told.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Okay.
All right, man.
Thank you.
Yo, can you drop them song requests?
Yeah. These are commercials, obviously, but yeah, let's get some song requests. I don't have any song requests, except for the like Sonic the Hedgehog and stuff. Sam is. Okay. Cool. Is this gonna be like really dubsteppy?
No,
like,
not at all.
Okay.
It's the complete opposite.
Okay.